So we find ourselves in the fourth week of this series entitled Rule Breaker. And we've been working through an understanding of how God has been revealing more of himself through the Ten Commandments. And now we arrive at this final conversation, one that describes how the law is fulfilled through love. And I want to begin by describing to you a story that really begins, I believe, to speak to what we are discussing tonight. It's a story about satisfaction. For many of us, we have endeavored at every point in our life to find satisfaction, to find fulfillment. In fact, if we were to look at major points throughout the course of our lives, we would see time and time again how a lot of our decisions, how a lot of our passions, how a lot of our pursuits have been driven towards finding fulfillment in life. It is one of the fundamental and core questions that each of us, as we move throughout the stages of our lives, endeavors to answer. And that was no different for me. Growing up, I knew that I had a passion to serve Jesus and to see the gospel made known to my friends, to my family, to my neighbors. But I always seemed to be missing the sense of satisfaction, the sense of fulfillment in the places and stages that God had me. When I would go to school, or when I would go to youth group, or when I would encounter friends, family, neighbors, it always seemed to come back to this place where I was longing for, desiring to be somewhere in life that I wasn't quite yet. And for many of us, we've had a similar perspective. We've longed to be higher on the corporate ladder, or more advanced in our careers, or to be at a different stage in our family life, or to have more friends, more money, whatever the passion might be. And for many of us, multiple passions were on that list. And we desire to pursue that with all of who we are. And at the core of each and every person's existence, at the core of who we were created to be, we were made to be loved. We were made to be cared for in greater ways than we can imagine. It is the core of who we are, and it's what has been written on our hearts. And it's a question that has begun to burn in each and every one of us. How can I experience satisfaction and fulfillment in this life? And as we transition to a text, we're going to experience a similar principle of how this great law that we have been spending these last 4 weeks engaging with ultimately finds its fulfillment through love. But the question comes, how does that accomplish? How is the law truly fulfilled through love? Because if we understand the context of the law, we begin to realize that there are actually, at the time of Jesus, 613 laws that were governing those who lived in Israel and those who considered themselves to be part of the Jewish faith. And so the first answer, and really the main answer that we will be spending time with this evening, is this idea of true love satisfying the law. Satisfying those 613 moral, purification, and ceremonial laws that began to etch themselves into the human soul. And so we're going to be spending time in Romans chapter 13, but before we go there, I want to anchor ourselves now in Genesis 15 to begin to understand more of the Old Testament context for where we'll find ourselves this evening. And we're going to be spending time in Genesis 15, verses 7 through 10, and then we're going to jump down the page a little bit to 17 through 19. So let's read this passage together. He also said to him, I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, to the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. And this covenant that was being established between God and Abraham actually has significant context that, as we explore, I pray will enlighten our perspective about how God has interacted with the world through the context of love. Because in these days, when someone made a covenant with someone else, both parties would walk through these cut animals. This is a practice that Abram was very familiar with, especially with sheep, to signify that death would fall upon the responsible party should the covenant be broken. Both parties, the ones who were making the covenant together, would walk down this aisle, this should sound familiar to us, and would recite the vows of this covenant at the end of the aisle. But often in this day, these covenants took a slightly different form, and it was called a suzerain and a vassal covenant, where only one party would walk through the slain animals. That was because at this point in ancient world politics, smaller kingdoms, weaker kingdoms would often find themselves under the protection of greater kingdoms. They'd pledge themselves to these kingdoms, and while maintaining some form of autonomy or sovereignty, they ultimately were responsible to these greater kingdoms. And so this is this covenant that we are seeing being made known in Genesis 15. But as Abraham, or Abram, the weaker party, himself would be getting ready to walk to God at the end of the aisle to signify that the responsibility of the covenant would be put on him, instead, God puts him to sleep. And instead, God himself, in the form of the same all-consuming fire pictured in Exodus chapters 19 and 20, walks through the slain animals. In this ceremony, as the greater party, as the protecting king, only God walked through the aisle, indicating that should this covenant be broken for any reason, he would be the one to die. And that would be the pattern by which he would make all of his covenants, that he would be the one to bear ultimate responsibility should they be broken. Ultimately, we see this realized in the coming of his son, Jesus. And this love that dominated all of the covenants that were created flew in the face of the narrative of the day. No longer was it about my own advancement when I'm making a covenant with God, because consuming humility was the defining characteristic, and love being its language of these covenants. And this is where we find ourselves now in Romans chapter 13. It begins in this way in verse 8. It says this, let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command, to love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Love does not, this is the end of the verse, does not just fulfill the penalty of the law, but its purpose, to bring glory to the only one who could fulfill it. Let me word this another way. The gap between the standard of the law, in other words, the perfection of the law, and the standard of my life, where I fall short of that law, is where the glory of God shines brightest. And this is because we have been so deeply loved. And as a result of that, it is our responsibility to love others in the same way we have been loved. May we maintain the same perspective found in Genesis chapter 15. May the humility and love of Almighty God be the banner under which we engage with the world. Because the ethic that drove the church in Rome was not one of self-preservation, but was one of gospel-centered mission. That they would be used by God in amazing ways, yes, but the motivation being that they are to love the world. Therefore, the law and the purpose of it was not about them. The purpose of the law is for God's glory, friends, and not my or your blessing. Then we can understand the mission we are to have, to love how we have been loved. Isn't it amazing that on the platform of a conditional covenant, God proves this unconditional love? And this leads us to the main point, that the love of God fulfills the law because Jesus was the sacrifice required. That ultimately the law would point to the need of this reality, that none of us could stand in the face of 613 laws and perfectly measure up to the standard they created. And friends, when that becomes our reminder, love is no longer just the appeasement of the law, it's the fulfillment. It's not just the removal of the penalty, it's the reason the law was created. It is the law fully realized. Love is the language of God. God wrote the law as a reflection of his holiness, fully knowing that he would be the one to fulfill it. The standard of his nature demanded his sacrifice, and the motivation for all of this was love. Therefore, may we love like Jesus. May we take the example of the Roman church, who brought an empire to its knees, not because of effective protesting or this crowd running around looking after our rights. May we take their example and instead look at the world as people who are desperately in need of the love of God like we are. May we look no further than the example of Jesus and the lives that he changed. And may this be the rallying cry for the church. May love be the motivation by which we engage with God and we engage with the world around us. As Romans 13 describes, loving our neighbor is the fulfillment of the law because that was what the law required. And when we remember that God invites us into a greater story than we could imagine, when we remember that God reminds us of his love, not just for us, but also for the world through the lens of sacrifice, it no longer becomes about what we want, but his glory in the world around us. And this is how love has shown itself through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the example he sets to us to share that love to the entire world.